2020, years are easy, decades are harder. Time to look forward to the decade that's upon us. Now, one of my favorite quotes attributed to Bill Gates is that people overestimate what will happen in a year and underestimate what will happen in a decade. This is an important decade for the mankind. It's a decade in which we'll need to find answers to questions that hang over us. We left 2019 behind with public protests on half of the world's streets. With the economic crisis so many have warned of still to surface, new examples of Donald Trump's unusual foreign policy at the helm of what remains a leading global power and growing awareness of the climate emergency and gender gap. So what will the world look like in 2020? Which major challenges will shape the decade that's just beginning? 2020 in the eyes of key international broadcasters around the world. Hello, I'm Jennifer Moon in Seoul, joined by my colleagues Steve Herman in Washington, Stephen Beardsley in Berlin, and Tetsuo Sakabe from NNA, Japan's business arm of Kyodo News Group, and this is 2020, the year ahead. Now, defining issues that will shape 2020, first and foremost, the U.S. presidential election. American presidential elections have an impact that goes far beyond U.S. national borders. People around the world follow the campaign for the U.S. presidency with great interest, and many feel that they have a stake in the outcome. South Korea is, of course, no exception, watching closely whether there will be a leadership change for its only ally, as it affects everything from North Korea's denuclearization process to joint efforts in tackling common global concerns. Let me begin with you, Steve. Tell us about the political climate as the U.S. enters the election year. I mean, it definitely appears to be extra complicated with the impeachment trial of Donald Trump.
Yes, Jen, it is a hyper-partisan atmosphere all the time since Donald Trump was elected 4 years ago, but even more so now. However, I wouldn't overemphasize the impact of the impeachment in the election this year. By the time we roll around in November, it'll be a distant memory. It's extremely unlikely, of course, that the Senate trial will result in the president's removal. He'll be out there campaigning on this, perhaps as a badge of honor, and perhaps Democrats will not really want to bring it up all the time. And opinions are pretty much baked in about Donald Trump already. There'll be a very small sliver of independent voters and Democrats who sometimes have leaned towards the Republican Party, as they did in 2016, in a few select swing states such as Wisconsin.
Now, Stephen, what about in Europe? How likely do Europeans see Mr. Trump being reelected? I mean, how do you expect the reelection to impact Europe?
I think, Jen, I think that they're going to see it as more of let's say this, they wouldn't be surprised if it happens. Not like they were in 2016, when, like everyone else, they were taken by surprise and they were really taken aback. Seeing Trump is really the antithesis to a lot of the values that Europeans hold dear. If he is reelected, again, I don't think it would be that much of a surprise. It would be another difficult 4 years for Europe, which feels like it has often been targeted by President Trump, and it would really leave them bracing for things like auto tariffs, which could actually come into place even before the election, and more difficulties with NATO and with other issues that the U.S. and Europe have shared in the past. In terms of how it would impact Europe, all of those measures. But again, I think that Europeans also look at the U.S. and they see that something has changed. Regardless if President Trump wins re-election, they believe that he is an expression of something that's changed in the U.S. electorate, something that is very skeptical of international cooperation, that is skeptical of a lot of the values that Europe says that it holds high. So I think that they don't believe that it's just about Mr. Trump anymore, but that they have to accept that America itself is changing.
Sure. Now, as another key ally of the U.S. in the Asia-Pacific region, what's the reaction from Japan, Tetsuo?
So according to the opinion poll conducted by Gallup and Yomiuri Shimbun, so almost 80% of Japanese people think that it is not so good for Mr. Trump to be elected, because many Japanese people think that Trump is unstable, unpredictable because of his American first policy. But so many hope his win in the election, because they came to the realization that Mr. Trump is not so disruptive to the relationship between Japan and the U.S. And also many political leaders think that it is only Mr. Abe who can cope with Mr. Trump. For example, they can play enjoying golf so many times. So some people think that Mr. Abe should seek for another terms by revising LDP rules.
Jen, what about the situation in South Korea?
Well, Steve, although both administrations, both the U.S. and South Korea, have reaffirmed on various occasions that South Korea-U.S. alliance remains ironclad, there is no denying in the fact that the two sides have seen their disagreements over the approach to North Korea. And of course, they're currently in the process of negotiating Donald Trump's demands that so sharply increase its share of the cost for housing 28,500 American troops on the Korean Peninsula. Now, that's not to say that the re-election of President Donald Trump is not favored here in South Korea, as the Moon Jae-in administration, more than any other governments at this point, wants the tension on the Korean Peninsula to ease. And it's well aware that North Korea-U.S. summits were made possible because of personal rapport between Donald Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. And of course, it's in this vein that South Korean President Moon Jae-in, in his New Year's press conference, warned that November's U.S. presidential election threatens to limit what progress can be made on nuclear talks between Washington and North Korea, saying when the U.S. enters the campaign period in earnest, it may not be easy for them to make time for the North Korea-U.S. talks. Hence, the two sides do not have much time left. That, of course, comes short of and does not clearly spell out how and whether the U.S. election results will impact North Korea's denuclearization process and Korean Peninsula issues. Now, Steve, how big of a foreign policy change, especially vis-a-vis North Korea, do we expect post-November election?
Well, Jen, that all depends on who wins the election. If it's Donald Trump, as Stephen in Berlin pointed out, the Europeans know what they are getting. And as Tetsuo noted, there's a very clear-eyed view of Trump's policies in Japan as well. And we've seen his outreaches, which have been historical, to Kim Jong-un in North Korea. Now, if the Democrats win and it's Joe Biden, the former vice president, we can expect much of what we saw during the Obama administration, as Biden was there and has substantial experience. If it's another candidate who wins the Democratic nomination, someone who does not have that foreign policy experience, we can expect a reset across the board, and very much will depend on who they bring in as their Secretary of State and National Security Advisor.
Now, South Korean President Moon Jae-in, in his recent New Year's presser, signaled that South Korea may pursue inter-Korean projects, a move that could put Seoul at odds with the Trump administration. South Korea, of course, has abided by the U.S.-led regime of strict international sanctions, but Mr. Moon has said that he believes there is room for the two Koreas to cooperate on the border areas and resume individual tourism. Now, do you guys see this being realized in 2020? I want to start with Stephen.
It's hard for us to say. From a European perspective, really, a lot of the foreign policy doesn't have a direct hand in the Korean issue. What Berlin would like to see, what Brussels would like to see, is a peaceful resolution to the tensions there, and obviously a de-escalation of tensions, whatever the process that entails. So they want to see across the board just basically a de-escalation. And here they've seen that what a lot of the tweeting back and forth that happened early in Trump's term before some of these summits, that of course was looked on very unfavorably here. So I think, the EU has a role to play economically, diplomatically in terms of their expertise, but they don't have a direct hand in those negotiations.
Now, Steve, I'm sure the U.S. has a much direct hand in this process.
Yes, but I think we've seen in the Trump administration that Trump has given both Seoul and Pyongyang somewhat of a wide latitude to talk to each other. as long as Pyongyang, as long as the North Koreans do not cross the red line, which is another underground nuclear test or firing off an ICBM.
Well, President Moon also reiterated hopes for a joint Korean team to compete at the Tokyo Olympics and for the countries to co-host the Games in 2032. Tetsuo, of course, Japan as the host country of the Tokyo Olympics, but also as an ally of the United States, is this something that Tokyo would like to see realized this summer?
Yeah, I think so. It will be very, welcome to Japanese people. So Tokyo Olympic is really deeply connected with, Pyeongchang Olympic and also Beijing Olympic. So that is the purpose of the Olympic.
So in the spirit of the Olympic Games, perhaps it's something that we would like to see. Now, for those of you just joining us, you're watching our New Year's special program, 2020, The Year Ahead, along with our colleague at VOA in Washington, DW in Berlin, and NNA, the business arm of Japan's Kyodo News Group. Defining issues that will shape 2020. Number 2, drifting economy. Now, we began 2019 with an acute sense of economic risk with many potential triggers. The trade war between the U.S. and China, the economic slowdown in Europe, particularly centered around the German engine, Brexit and Italian debt. Now, none of these concerns has dissipated at the start of 2020. Let's begin with a trade war between the world's two largest economies. After more than 2 years of rising tension, the U.S. and China have signed a deal aimed at calming trade frictions. The agreement has been hard-fought, but it's unclear how much economic relief from their trade war it'll offer. Steve, who are the winners and losers from this deal?
Well, I think it's really too early to make a definitive decision on that, but it's a win, obviously, for both sides to have some sort of de-escalation. The Trump administration calling this phase 1. Whether we see a phase 2 before the election in November does seem like a small possibility. But there are commitments there from the Chinese that are being applauded here. But Democratic Party politicians in this country are condemning the deal, saying that it's weak and it really does not do enough for America's farmers and workers.
Now, what about China? I mean, how does this affect Beijing? Is this a win for Chinese President Xi Jinping? Tetsuo?
So I don't think so because, first stage agreement is kind of, face-saving agreement. So I think conflict over technology, especially 5G, IoT, and chip making will continue. Personally, I really paying attention to Huawei. So Chinese semiconductor TSMC can provide chip to Huawei is very crucial. If not, Huawei will be really in trouble.
Well, definitely something that we will revisit at the end of our broadcast. Now, another top risk to the global economy in 2020 have been identified as extreme weather, climate action failure, natural disasters, biodiversity loss, and human-made environmental disasters. In other words, climate crisis. For the first time, environmental concerns dominate the top 5 long-term global risks for business leaders, investors, and policymakers surveyed in the World Economic Forum's annual report. Stephen, how serious is climate change being taken by European countries? What kind of measures can we expect from Europe to tackle the challenges before us?
Jen, is being taken very seriously. There was actually recently the federal government Agency for Security Policy in Germany recently released a study, a survey among regular Germans of what they considered the biggest security issues that they saw around them, the biggest domestic security issues and world security issues. Now, for the past few years, it's been migration. Remember, Germany has seen a flood of migration from countries like Syria and Afghanistan. As that's slowed down, now they say that the climate is the biggest security issue. Right? This is something where others might say nuclear war, where others might say conflict between the Koreas. In Germany, they say it's the climate. And so that gives you an idea of how important and how that's risen to the top of the agenda here. In terms of what you might see for policy, Germany, for example, just released its climate package in which it plans to become carbon neutral by 2050, mostly by raising the price of carbon through an emissions trading scheme, sort of like what the EU is already doing and what's already been curbing a lot of CO2 production here in Europe. The question is, can it act fast enough for environmentalists who really want to push that further? And that's the tension you're going to see in the year ahead and in the decade ahead, is the tension between those who believe that the governments must act quicker and the governments that are led by people like Angela Merkel, who say politics is the art of the possible. We will do what we can as soon as we can. And on the other side, they're saying that's not soon enough. That's going to be an underlying tension and a huge deal for Europe in the coming year and decade.
So that is Europe and that is Germany. Now, Steve, the United States is the only nation quitting the Paris Agreement, with Mr. Trump doubting that man-made emissions are the main cause of worsening climate change. Is the U.S. divided in 2020 over climate issues?
Oh, absolutely. And you're going to see the Democrats campaigning on the lack of action on climate change by President Trump, but you're also going to see the president himself out on the campaign trail taking credit for pulling the U.S. out of the accord, which he claims was very unfair to the United States. That is a message that resonates with his base. And because the Republicans control the upper house of the legislature, the Senate, there's not going to be any significant legislation coming through. And even if it got to the president's desk, he would veto it.
Jen, what's the approach to climate change in South Korea these days? And do you expect to see anything more happening in the coming year?
Well, absolutely. The South Korean government recently finalized a goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 32% by 2030 from 2017 levels as part of its efforts to cut down greenhouse gases. They've also set a goal of increasing the cumulative supply of low-emission vehicles to nearly 3.9 million. That comprises electric cars and hydrogen vehicles by 2030. Now, on a more global level and a more symbolic move by this once rapidly industrializing economy is the hosting of the second P4G summit in June this year. P4G, or Partnering for Green Growth, and the Global Goals 2030 is a new international initiative supported by countries, businesses, international organizations, academia, and civil society to find solutions for green economic growth. Now, as climate change emerged as one of key criteria that will shape 2020, another question that could be raised is whether climate change or climate crisis policy act as a factor in the upcoming U.S. election. Steve, you briefly mentioned this, but will it play as a factor for you?
Well, I think that is something that really remains to be seen. We're well aware of what are the issues that this administration has baked in, but you're definitely going to see with the campaign heating up during the year, it's really something I would not expect any major change until we get into the next administration. And if it's President Trump again after November, then things pretty much stay the same.
Well, climate crisis, another key word for 2020. For those of you just joining us, you're watching our New Year's special program, 2020, the year ahead, along with our colleagues at VOA in Washington, DW in Berlin, and NNA, the business arm of Japan's Kyodo News Group. Now, on to our final keyword that will define 2020, new technology. Now, 2020 will be the year of 5G, and the decade begins in which we'll see great advances in the fields of artificial intelligence and quantum computing, which may radically alter the economic system, security policies, and power relations. The buzz at the consumer tech industry's biggest annual showcase earlier this year was fake meat, fake humans, and fake privacy. Now, what are some key strategic tech trends that you guys are focusing in on? Let me start with you, Steve.
Well, I think self-driving cars and drones are capturing a lot of the public attention here and a lot of money. But I think as much as looking ahead and dreaming about how technology is going to change our lives for good, there's also a lot of people and sectors taking a step back and questioning about whether all of this is really intruding too much into our lives. So privacy is a huge concern, and there is a battle brewing between the major tech companies and the politicians, and that to some degree has been bipartisan. So a lot of these tech giants are really starting to get concerned about a stronger regulatory environment here, something I think that the Europeans have actually been ahead of the United States on for a bit of time.
Stephen, do you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, absolutely. That is something that Europe is really watching the U.S. closely for. Data regulation has been a big topic here. Privacy and what Europeans consider anti-competitive behavior among the big companies like Google and Facebook. The EU has fined all of those companies many times over in several cases, and they're waiting to see if the U.S. is really going to pick up and do the same thing. Data regulation is really a big concern here. It will be a concern for this year, the next year. One of the things that you should look at Europe to look at doing is looking at its own cloud service. Is there a way that it can create a cloud network that adheres to European data regulations and allows big corporations like BMW, like Siemens, to store their data and know that they are following European regulations and that it can't be subpoenaed, for example, in the US or in another nation? I would only just add that a big tech concern here is not necessarily a new one, and it's electric vehicles. The auto industry in Germany employs 800,000 people. It's a big deal here. The auto companies are all cutting costs right now as they look to invest big in electric vehicles, and that investment is not guaranteed. So there is a lot of concern among politicians and amongst business about how that will turn out. And I wanted to ask Jen, actually, what about you in South Korea? What are you guys looking at there? I imagine it's much different than what we're concerned about here in Europe.
Well, you know what? I would not say we're too much different from Europe or the US or the rest of the world. Of course, here in South Korea, we're excited to see the rollout of Super 8K TVs, vertical TVs, Samsung's latest artificial humans, and not to leave out Hyundai Motor and Uber's collaboration, flying taxis. But at the same time, with the rapid development of these technologies, one key strategic tech trend in 2020 will be, like you guys mentioned, transparency and traceability. And this trend, of course, requires a focus on 6 key elements of trust: ethics, integrity, openness, accountability, competence, and consistency. And it brings me to this vision of the future. In half of the world, driverless cars built by Baidu and connected by Huawei's 5G wireless networks carry passengers who shop online with Alibaba and post selfies on WeChat. In the other half, those activities are dominated by companies like Amazon, Google, Facebook, Tesla, and Ericsson. On one side, the internet is tightly controlled. On the other, it's freer. Now, Steve, a divided world not along ideological lines, but along digital standard lines. Would you say this is a possibility in 2020 or perhaps this decade?
Yeah, I think we're going to see quite a bit of movement, not this year, but during this decade. And really what it's going to be about is who sets the standards. And we've had quite a bit of international agreement and consensus since the internet began. But now there are here, at least, rising national security concerns. When you mention Huawei, that's almost a word that's equivalent to Chinese spying in the United States today. And there's even a tremendous amount of scrutiny with such seemingly innocuous apps as TikTok, because of the fact that it's also controlled by a Chinese company, and it's able to access your audio and your video on your phone. So yes, there's a greater divide in the world between the haves and the have-nots, but even those who have are increasingly questioning whether they really want to have it.
Well, Tetsuo, what are your thoughts on this? I mean, is there a possibility of a digital Cold War even?
Yeah, I totally agree with Steve. So I'm afraid that this world will be, polarized. So in terms of technology, this is not what happened in real Cold War in 1970s and 1980s. So I'm afraid there's a possibility that we need to choose, for example, from Cisco or from Huawei. So it will be very polarized world.
Definitely, these new technologies and digital standards will change the way we live, we work, and the way we interact with one another in the new year and the new decade. But what's for sure is that the world remains an unpredictable place again in 2020 as we make the turn of a new decade. Well, that wraps up our New Year's special, 2020, the year ahead in the eyes of international broadcasters. I'd like to thank my colleague Steve Herman for VOA in Washington, Stephen Beersley for DW in Berlin, and Tetsuo Sakabe for NNA Kyoto News Group, and of course, all of you for staying with us all throughout. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.